We used to talk about breastfeeding on demand. Now we talk about breastfeeding on cue. And think about the breastfeeding mother who is a survivor, and her baby just indicates, I want your breast now. So you think, oh God, I got to give you my breast. It's an inner battle. She wants the very best for her baby. She knows what that is, and yet her body won't let her give over. The pain, sometimes no letdown, sometimes inadequate milk supply, baby not gaining weight, that sort of thing. And she's dreading every single feeding.
Balloons, bazookas, boobies, bosoms, boulders, cans, hooters, knockers, melons, honkers, jugs, rack, tatas, tits, torpedoes, guns, bust, doorknobs, coconuts, and our favorite one, the girls. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, where your host, Lori, highlights mothers just like yourself and goes beyond the surface questions and digs deep so they share not only their joys and happiness in their daily breastfeeding life, but also their pain and struggles and how they worked through them.
Episode number 102. Welcome to the All About Breastfeeding show, the place where the girls hang out. I am your host, Lori Jill Eisenstadt, IBCLC. Before we begin today's show, I want to remind everyone of the contest we're having here at All About Breastfeeding. This is my way of celebrating and thanking you for hanging out with me for 100 shows. All you need to do is answer a few questions and you can win a boba wrap or a Bravado nursing bra or a Skype consult with me. Here is what you need to do. Go to Facebook and search for these 4 words, All About Breastfeeding Community, and join our Facebook group. You will see a post there with the questions you need to answer to win a prize. It is really easy peasy. Everyone who has entered so far has a shot at the prize. I'm telling you, it's quite easy to enter, and when the contest is over, 3 winners will be chosen. Good luck, everyone. How exciting it is to begin Season 2 with episode number 102, which features a long-time idol of mine. My guest today doesn't know this, however, I met her many years ago in a friend's home on Long Island. The Birth Partner was a fairly new book, and my childbirth educator friends and I were just learning about what it means to be a labor support person, and we were learning about this new profession called a birth doula. We were a small group of less than maybe about 10 moms, and we were supposed to meet for about 2 hours in this friend's home with this author, and we wound up talking until the wee hours of the morning. She really left us with a great impression, and I have followed her career ever since. We talk about how her career has evolved from being a trained physical therapist to become a childbirth educator, and then training others to become a labor support person. Along the way, she has written books and studied mothers and how the trauma and abuse in their life has the potential to affect their childbearing years and specifically their birth and breastfeeding experiences. Penny Simkin is a physical therapist who has specialized in childbirth education and labor support since 1968. She estimates she has prepared over 13,000 women, couples, and siblings for childbirth. She has assisted hundreds of women and couples through childbirth as a doula. She is author or co-author of books for both parents and professionals, including the Labor Progress Handbook, which I enjoyed, Pregnancy, Childbirth, and the Newborn, the Complete Guide, which I use for all my classes, and When Survivors Give Birth, Understanding and Healing the Effects of Early Sexual Abuse on Childbearing Women. And one of my favorites as a childbirth educator, The Birth Partner, a complete guide to childbirth for dads, doulas, and all other labor companions. She has developed teaching materials for birth classes and produced several videos for educators, doulas, and families, the latest of which is for siblings-to-be, There's a Baby. She is co-founder of DONA, D-O-N-A International, formerly Doulas of North America, and PATTCH, Prevention and Treatment of Traumatic Childbirth. Currently, Penny serves on the editorial board of the journal Birth, Issues in Perinatal Care, and serves on the senior faculty of the Simkin Center for Allied Birth Vocations at Bastyr University, which was named in her honor. Today, her practice consists of childbirth education, birth counseling, and labor support, combined with a very busy schedule of conferences and workshops. Penny and her husband Peter have 4 grown children and 8 grandchildren ranging from ages 11 to 28, 2 grandchildren-in-laws, and a pug named Lola. Find out more about Penny at her website, www.pennysimkin.com. Penny, I would love to welcome you to the All About Breastfeeding show, and I'm thrilled that you're able to spend some time with us.
Thank you very much, Lori. I'm looking forward to it.
I think everybody can go on your website, which I will list, and see that you do have an amazing schedule for conferences and workshops. It amazes me how busy you continue to be.
Well, it amazes me as well.
Which means you must love your work.
I love my work, and sometimes I wonder, where am I going now? I'm on the plane. What city am I going to? But I try to make sure that I have the material straight in my head.
Well, I'm sure, I know you're a pro at it. We could probably put 10 different subjects in front of you, and you could talk eloquently about them all.
Well, let's not try that.
Let's start off with something that you're pretty familiar with. I would just love to know a little bit of background about what life is like for you and the family you grew up in. I think lots of times we get to know the authors and the work that they do and what they're interested in. And I always think it's nice to know a little personal information that perhaps people don't know about you.
Well, it's been a long life, and I was born in Maine, and I'm the third of 6 children. And it was, I think, a very healthy childhood. A small town, and I could run around town. We'd never do that today. Our parents were very loving and very service-minded. I was very proud of my father, especially. My mother did more of the homework. My father was a community leader, and they expected a lot of us. So it was a good childhood.
When you say your father was a community leader, was that his work, or that's what he did in his volunteer time?
That was his volunteer time. He was a hardware store owner. The customer was always right. But he served on the water commission and the school board and other positions in our small town.
I know that life. My father owned an appliance store, and yes, the customer was always right.
Yeah.
Tell me, when you were younger, because you've done so much now in your adult life, but working in the field of maternal health, working with couples and children and birth and breastfeeding and birth trauma, is that anything in your late teens, early 20s that you thought that you would be doing at this point in your life?
No. The one thing about me that I've always known about myself was that I love to teach. I was teaching my younger sister how to clean my room, for example. But I have always been a teacher. And so I think I expected that to be part of my life. But I was trained in physical therapy, and I loved physical therapy and had expected that I would go on and just continue as a physical therapist. But then having 4 children in rather rapid succession in the very early mid-60s, women with children didn't work. So I had to kind of give up my career. I spent 1 morning a week in a physical therapy clinic, and that was all I could manage. So the childbirth work didn't come along until after I'd had all my children, and then I had one of my daughters was in a cooperative preschool, and the president of the preschool was also involved in the Childbirth Education Association. And I heard her telling one of the other parents who was a nurse that they needed educators. And I said, "Do you need physical therapists?" And they took me. That was back in 1968 that I became a childbirth educator, and I have loved it ever since I ever since started.
Did you develop your own program?
Well, no, I was part of the Childbirth Education Association, and I was using their curriculum, but I soon became the head of the organization, and then I could craft my own approach to childbirth.
Was that the ICEA? That's what I know of, International Childbirth Education Association?
Ours was a local branch. It was called the Childbirth Education Association of Seattle. But yes, I was a part of ICEA. I was on their board for six years or so, and I've always had very good feelings about ICEA all my career.
With reference to your births, I'm sure there are things that you learned along the way, how birth affected breastfeeding.
You know, during the births, I didn't learn very much. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that, but I did what I was told. I happened to have a doctor who said I would be a good candidate for natural childbirth. Hooray. Because if he had said, you ought to have a cesarean 10 days before your due date, I would have said, okay. You know, I knew nothing. And so he kind of steered me on the right track. A lot of people would be amazed that any doctor would suggest such a thing these days. That started me off, but I took no classes. I thought, why do people have to learn how to have a baby, for crying out loud? So I went into it kind of blind, and I was not able to have a natural birth. My son weighed 10 pounds and 4 ounces, and he was persistent occiput posterior and 22 days overdue. But I gave it my best shot, then had to have a forceps rotation under general anesthetic. But I want to tell you one thing about that. I felt horrible after that because I'd always lived to kind of please other people. And he told me to have a natural birth, and I didn't do it. And I felt awful. And that guy saved my life because 2 or 3 days after the birth, he came through on rounds. I can remember this so clearly. North Carolina, no air conditioning. I had a sheet over me for modesty. He kind of grabbed my ankle, over the sheet and gave it a little shake and looked me in the eye and said, "What a trooper." And his saying that, I call that story 3 little words. He said that to me, and that allowed me to think, oh, maybe I'm not so bad after all. To have the person that I was trying to please tell me he was pleased. And it's horrible that I lived that way, but that's the way I was. I'm so grateful for that because I think I would not be doing this work if I continued to feel inadequate in giving birth.
It also probably helps you a little bit be understanding and empathetic towards moms who do feel that way.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's never been a problem for me.
So you started working and teaching childbirth education, and how did that evolve into DONA?
Wow. Well, that's kind of a convoluted story, but the teaching really grabbed me, and I still love to teach. I teach 2 classes a week plus a class for children once a month, and I love that. But my students taught me an awful lot. They taught me more than I probably taught them, but we would always have class reunions, and I was in touch with them, and some of them would have had very difficult births. They wouldn't be able to talk about it. That led me to recognize that we can't just drop people after they've had a child. And we didn't know much about postpartum mood disorders or anything at that time. We didn't know anything about the impact of abuse. We found out, and actually it was that work. I started that when my students told me how their births were so difficult. But it was, in terms of DONA, it really was a study that I did when I'd been teaching for 20 years, which was in the late 80s. I was thinking about leaving teaching because it wasn't so gratifying. People were saying, well, birth is one day in a woman's life, so why should we put 8 weeks of education into that? We should be doing other kinds of education. And I began to think maybe they were right. But I decided to go back and interview some of the people that I had in my original classes in 1968. I want to know, do you even remember that day? Maybe I'm the only one that cares. So I designed a study, and I don't want to take too much time with it, but I had the birth stories they had written right after their babies were born. I've never thrown those away, still have them. I found 24 women and who all said yes. Everyone that I found said yes, they would do this. They wrote another story with the same kind of questionnaire I had the first time. And the stories were so similar, with 20 years difference. And then I had them for an interview, and we talked about it. And what I found out was that it wasn't how the women gave birth that was the most compelling impression that came out of this. It's how they remembered being cared for. So many of the women, all of them, were being prepared for natural birth because that's what people took classes for in those days. And some could not have that. And some of those people that couldn't have the natural birth felt great about it. Some of the people who had a natural birth felt horrible. It wasn't natural or medicated or whatever, but it was how they remembered being cared for by their doctors and nurses. We had no midwives even practicing then. And right then I thought, how we care for women matters more than anything else. And you don't have to be a doctor or a midwife or have a doctorate to do this. So I started focusing on finding ways to make sure that women were well cared for. We had nursing shortages. We always have nursing shortages. So I dreamed up this whole idea of training people I call them labor support people, to go with women and their partners and help them out during labor. I designed a curriculum, and it took me 2 years to find anybody that would help me sponsor it. Well, actually, 1988, we did the very first training here in Seattle. We've continued. We're now doing 10 trainings a year in the Seattle area for birth doulas. Seeing the need and seeing how the doula, which we started to call her rather than labor support person, how she could really make a difference. I looked around, and of course, our good friends, Marshall Klaus and John Kennel, had been finding the same thing with research studies from Guatemala, that having a kind, knowledgeable, kind of middle-aged, plump woman is how they often described her, sitting with a woman, someone who had confidence in birth, someone that could hold her hand and cluck over her. They found that shortened labors in Guatemala. I knew Marshall already, and I knew them both a little bit, and Marshall's wife, Phyllis, who's my dear friend. And so we decided to make an organization. And Annie Kennedy, who is right here in Seattle, is a real good organizer. And we brought her in. So the 5 of us founded right then. Then it was called Doulas of North America, DONA. DONA actually was incorporated in 1992. That's how it got started. And it was, I think, my interest in the emotional part of it, and Marshall and John's interest in the physical, improved physical outcomes, that it kind of brought us together. And the doula came out of all that.
It probably doesn't surprise you to know that that's still the same. Childbirth education is still very important, but you still have probably see the same thing again and again, that it's the way that we are treated during labor, how much, and we know that there's a certain part of labor that we cannot control, but when we think people are telling us what to do and trying to control our labor, that affects us also. And so you've probably continued to learn the same thing again and again. You probably still feel the same way, that it's really about not necessarily how we actually give birth to our baby, but how we're treated during our labor. That really is what resonates with us 30 and 40 and 50 years later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and I talk to people in their 80s, and they remember their birth experiences so clearly. Well, they might not remember what they had for breakfast this morning, but they do remember those birth stories, and how they were treated, how they felt they were treated is key. Yeah, that's part of my class now. I tell them about that study. It changed my life by making me more committed than ever to childbirth education, labor support, and good care, trying to change the birth environment as well.
And it's just overflowed into thousands and thousands of other people's lives. Not only, it affected people like me who became a doula because of that. And then, of course, the women and the families that we work with and how we are with them. So what starts is this twinkle of an idea with you, that you get together with other friends, you combine efforts. Like a lot of things we do, I think, in mothering and the work that we do in childbirth, I love that saying, but it's so true. It takes a village. You have your part. Klaus has their part. The other, I forget, did you say Ann Kennedy? I'm not familiar with her.
Annie Kennedy. Yeah, she is actually the administrator at the director of the Simkin Center here at Bastyr.
Okay, yes. So what she brought to the table is probably something that you really needed to bring everything all together to then market it and get out there.
And she's been great at that.
Yeah.
She and I have done a lot of mischief together over the years.
Oh, well, maybe we should change the course of this interview and talk about all the mischief. I'm sure you had a lot of fun together.
Well, she was one of the co-founders of PATCH as well, that you mentioned, Prevention and Treatment of Traumatic Childbirth.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that, because I feel like we do have a lot of information, and it is interesting to learn about birth, and it is interesting to learn about doulas and what they bring to the table. But I'm curious to talk about what stories were you hearing? What made you then realize, oh, this is another part of birth that I really need to pay attention to, and that is birth trauma.
Right. That was, again, I learned that from my students. when they would tell me their birth story and start to cry out of remorse or humiliation or shame or anger, I think that's not the way it's supposed to be. Many women, I don't think they necessarily used the word trauma, but that's what they were describing, was that they were actually suffering during childbirth. And sometimes, of course, we know that the physical experience of birth isn't always perfect. And sometimes the mother has physical damage as a result. Sometimes the baby has damage. Sometimes the baby doesn't live. And sometimes women have long-lasting harm from their birth experience of a physical nature. And that's one type of trauma that is it's kind of a constant reminder of the birth experience. But the other side of it is the way she's treated. And we've already talked about that a little bit. But if a woman feels humiliated or ignored or disrespected or left alone during the birth, that can be as traumatizing. I don't want to belittle the person who's had physical trauma, so I don't want it to hurt anyone's feelings there. But to be neglected can have very lasting effects on the person who's giving birth. And that's what I was learning from my students. And at the time, my understanding began when a sexual abuse survivor was telling me her story. She was at the reunion of the class. She couldn't talk about the birth, and she told her partner, you do it, you tell it. And I couldn't let that pass. So when we could get alone, I asked her, would you like to come talk about it? I didn't know what to do, but I felt somewhat responsible. I wasn't trying to prepare people for a birth they couldn't talk about out of grief. So I thought the least I can do is chat with her about it. And she came, and when she was telling me her story, it was a violent story. I reflected that to her, and I said, if I didn't know what you were talking about, I swear you were describing a rape. And she said, it was rape, and I've been raped, and I know. And that connection, that was a very dramatic moment for me to actually have somebody connect those two, because as soon as she said it, I knew it was true, that birth can have that kind of association for people who have been abused in the past. It's like a reenactment in some ways. And it's not all birth. It doesn't have to be that way. But when a woman brings a history, an injury, and a sense of, the trauma, we might talk more about the details there, into the birth, it takes less to re-traumatize her than if she didn't have that history. That person got me started thinking about this and thinking. And then I connected with Phyllis Klaus, my dear friend. She is a psychotherapist, and she and I kind of got into a much closer relationship over this topic. And that's when we wrote the book, When Survivors Give Birth. So that it was birth trauma originating in sexual abuse that got me started. And then I began to realize that traumatic births can happen to people that haven't had a history of sexual abuse, that other types of trauma can neglect and other kinds of physical violence in one's life, or those things can set the stage, but so can birth can also be the very first trauma that someone suffers. So I've started to really pay attention to that. That has really captured my interest, and I like to be able to give a little bit of extra attention to people that have a history of trauma and help them feel more optimistic or confident about the upcoming birth, or help them kind of deconstruct what happened to them if they had a traumatic birth, and help them to remove some of the blame that they often put on themselves for the fact that it didn't go the right way. So
how do you, if at all, bring that into classes? Because I think sometimes as a childbirth educator myself, it was even difficult for me to even bring in talking about cesarean section to couples, because of course we knew that it was a possibility, but you feel like you're bursting their bubble, talking about something negative. And then I always felt that way about women who have been abused. And, how should I bring that into class? Because you're then the Debbie Downer. But then if I totally left it out and didn't bring it up at all, then it kind of leaves them in the dark also, because they may not make that connection that they are bringing that to their birth experience, and may not know to talk to their provider. There are a lot of providers who are still not knowledgeable about bringing that up in prenatal visits. But, like what happened with you learn from your students. And once you start learning things, it's hard to ever go back and ignore what it is that you now know.
Right. And it is an uncomfortable place to be when you've learned this, but you don't know how to bring it up in class. I think it's a very fine line. The way I do it, and first of all, if there are childbirth educators that are listening in on this, if you don't have anything to offer, it's probably better not to bring it up than it is to say, this could really get in your way during birth. Good luck.
Leave it there like a little bomb.
Yeah. It would be better not to bring it up, in a direct form. What I have finally, kind of landed on as the best way for me to do it, I don't know if it would be better for others, but I will slip in a sentence or two. And it's usually when I'm describing a second stage of labor. And there's a natural holding back that I discuss there, that with the baby's head in the vaginal canal, the woman's first impulse might be to tighten up and not let it come. And then we talk about the need to let go, and I do some rehearsing on that. At that time, I'll say that sometimes for people who have suffered sexual abuse, the memories of abuse can come up in intention or in active memory. And I say, if anyone would like to talk to me privately about that, please see me after class. That's all I say. Practically every class, I'll have one or two people that may say, I'm surprised to hear that, or something like that. And then I do have a counseling approach that I've developed with Phyllis on a very practical approach to abuse, the triggers that it can bring up in childbirth, how we can predict those, how we can, figure out which ones are triggers for that particular person and why. And then we can come up with strategies for handling them if they do come up. I find this very rewarding personally, because I can see that often the woman feels a lot lighter when we're done with all that. Well, one woman said, I usually do this in 2 fairly lengthy sessions, but one woman after the first session, we had gone through all the triggers, there are 25 of them, and we had gone through them, and she had identified those that are triggers for her. And we talked about what it was about it that made it a trigger. And that was the end of our session. And I said, next time we're going to talk about our strategies. And as she left, she said, well, knowing my triggers is so helpful, because she'd had all this free-floating anxiety about it, and didn't even know what to do with it. And now we had nailed it down. It's this, and this that are really triggers for you. And then after our second appointment, when we came up with our strategies, she said, well, now I know my triggers, and I stared them down. And she felt so much more confident about that. I love to quote her. Sometimes, of course, if a trigger comes up in that first session, sometimes we have to deal with it right then. It's just too much to wait for the second appointment. I have found it a little more efficient. I don't charge for this counseling, so I like to make it efficient if I can. So I try to get through the triggers and their meanings first, and then deal with the strategies. But it's been a very rewarding thing to do for me. I don't have to be a psychotherapist to do this. I bring in my knowledge of birth, the options that you have, how you can talk to your care provider about this, how you can write a birth plan that will state your needs, and talk about whether you'd want to reveal your history. Some people do not want to. They don't want to have to say that, or they don't know who's going to read it. So they don't have to. We tailor our plan to their comfort.
Yeah, and again, it's how they're treated. I imagine half the battle is just for them to have known someone who knows that this can be something that they will need to talk about, whether it's then or at a future time, and how it might impact their birth, and that they do have someone to speak to before or after their birth about it.
Mm-hmm. Those are all really important things to do. And I try to take people where they are. And so the people that don't want to reveal their abuse, I tell them the advantages of letting the staff know, because sometimes abuse survivors are considered to be difficult patients. They may find, they may have difficulty with a vaginal exam, and they may resist it or tense up or cry out. And then the staff gets frustrated with them. Or they may have demands that seem unreasonable to the staff, like keep me covered at all times, knock before you come in, let my partner know why you're there. Things that are self-protective for the woman, and the staff may just roll their eyes if they don't get it. But if they understand that this woman has a history of abuse and these things would make her feel more comfortable, often the staff will get behind it 1,000% and want to make this a good birth for her. So I think that there are advantages in revealing that. But then I also talk to nurses a lot, and I'm trying to say, can you read between the lines? That you have to have it spelled out for you. But if you see people that have difficulty with vaginal exams, that they don't trust you right off the bat, I've got a list of things. Let it occur to you that this woman has a good reason for feeling this way.
Yeah, trust them, to just trust them, whatever they're telling you, that you don't even, that was one of the things that I realized early on working with moms in labor, is that I might not exactly know exactly why it is they're acting a way different that I'm not used to seeing, but there's probably a pretty good reason. And then, there was a point in my early career where I was quite naive. And then as I began to learn and go to conferences and meet people like you and read books, then I realized that there was a whole abuse component to everything that I feel kind of, well, I don't want to say embarrassed about it, but, I was just naive. I didn't know. But once I made that connection, 1 + 1 = 2. And I realized I didn't have to know everything. But then I did start to read between the lines, and I did start to make certain connections. And I didn't have to know everything, but all I had to know is that there's probably a correlation between how this woman is acting, which seems out of the ordinary, with something else in her past that is now, in the forefront for her.
Yep. Exactly. And that's all we need to know. Some people have made the mistake of feeling I've got to find out more. And, all the things you're doing at the time and the way you're feeling and acting, I wonder if you might have been abused. And then prodding, and that feels abusive to the client. She would tell if she were comfortable with that. In our positions, a therapist or a midwife or someone, sometimes they need to ask those questions, but we don't. We doulas, we childbirth educators, we birth counselors. The woman has the choice of revealing what she'd like us to know, but we can still have some wisdom. I do tell people in my workshops that a question to ask ourselves is, would it make more sense from the way this woman is expressing herself and the feelings and the worries she has? Would it make more sense if indeed she were an abuse survivor? And then if you answer yourself yes, then you don't have to say anything to her, but, and then you're going to see it through the filter of this would be traumatizing to an abuse survivor. It's often she's making a whole lot of sense with the history she brings into this experience. And if we can just give her credit for that, we can be much more effective in whatever care we're trying to provide.
And you don't even need to know that, to know that is sometimes good enough. You don't need to know the whole story, such as you just made mention of a few things. And one of them is how they wanted to be examined, where they wanted the sheets, how they wanted to be covered. Then all you need to do is just stop thinking that they are a quote unquote hard or difficult patient, and that there must be a reason why, and to just kind of let that go and go with the flow and let them be in charge and not try and control it so much.
Yeah, exactly.
I was grateful to learn about this information also before I started working with women with breastfeeding, because I recognized that in working with women with breastfeeding that all those abuse issues flowed into not only their birth, but their breastfeeding. So I started to connect some of those dots when I was working with women. I remember one of the very first time years ago was like, I just could not figure out. Everything about this situation in my mind, I said, this should be a breeze for her and her baby. Breast, nipple anatomy, baby's mouth, milk supply, like everything that I took a look at. I just could not understand why she seemed she came for help, but she also seemed quite aversive for bringing her baby to the breast, or once her baby is on the breast, she jumps and says how painful it is. And, in my mind, I'm trying to think, why? I just don't understand this. And, maybe there is something going on with the baby's mouth and et cetera. But when the baby comes off, everything looks beautiful and her nipple is exactly the way it should be. And her baby transferred milk. And yet she was shaking, like literally shaking. Some women crying, some women, after a couple of minutes taking their baby off saying, I can't do this. And I recognized, those things I didn't recognize. I was naive about some of the births that I was at, but it really helped me recognize that with women with breastfeeding, that there were more than likely some abuse issues that they were bringing to this consult with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the wonderful understanding that you gain when we realize there's a good reason, once again, there's good reason for her not being able to tolerate her baby at her breast, for example. I think that breastfeeding has been reduced to a physical process, a mouth, a nipple, a suckle. That's supposed to be all there is to it. And what a stupid assumption that is. This is definitely a psychological and emotional experience as much as it is a physical one. And so when all the physical things make sense, still very good reason for people not being able to tolerate breastfeeding. That is something that is very sad, because often most new mothers, of course, want to do the best thing for their babies. And abuse survivors often already have some sense of being less perfect, I don't know, but somehow damaged. As they've often been told by their perpetrator, you deserve this, and don't tell anybody. And so she feels kind of locked up, and she wants to do the right thing. She wants to breastfeed. She wants her baby to get the very best. And then she finds it very difficult to share her body with her baby. And when you think of it that way, the perpetrator was demanding that she share her body. And here's the baby, a little perpetrator. We used to talk about breastfeeding on demand. Now we talk about breastfeeding on cue. And think about the breastfeeding mother who is a survivor, and her baby just indicates, I want your breast now. So you think, oh God, I've got to give you my breast. It's an inner battle. She wants the very best for her baby. She knows what that is, and yet her body won't let her give over. The pain, sometimes no letdown, sometimes inadequate milk supply, baby not gaining weight, that sort of thing. And she's dreading every single feeding. And I think that sometimes the lactation consultant has kind of missed that. And, when you think about it, it would be abnormal if this woman could give over her breast as easily as anybody else with a history like that, especially if the breasts were the main target of the abuse. It would be abnormal for her to just be able to share her body. So, rather than thinking there's something abnormal about her, she's behaving in a very normal way for someone who's gone through what she's gone through. We start there, and then what's the best thing we can do here? And I think we have to be very flexible and creative in finding ways for the woman to do the best she possibly can for her baby without having this be an abusive experience every time she feeds.
Have you heard that Phoenix, Arizona is blessed with an amazing birthing center? Baby Moon Inn Birth Center is the best option for families who want access to midwifery care in and out of a hospital setting. You can experience birth in a comfortable home-like setting where natural birth is the focus. Laboring in water, being able to walk outside during labor, and enjoy the beautiful garden. This is what birth can be like for you. There is so much more to learn about Baby Moon. The staff would love to have the opportunity to meet you and would like to extend an invitation for you to attend a free Choices in Childbirth class and a tour of the birth center. All you need to do is call 602-314-7755. That's 602-314-7755 and ask for the tour dates. You can also go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/podcast. And on the right-hand side of the page, you will see a link that will bring you to the calendar, and you can sign up for the tour yourself. When you come in for the tour, make sure that you tell them you found out about it from the All About Breastfeeding podcast, and you will be given a very lovely free gift. Now, back to the show. You mentioned a few of the signs that you might see. So I'm interested to know, what is it that you do with women who are coming for help with breastfeeding, but clearly giving signs that they're having great difficulty. They're really torn. And sometimes I find probably the worst thing for me is a realization that they are currently living with their abuser.
Oh, I have not dealt with a lot of women who are currently living with their abuser. I can't really help with that. That's an enormous problem because she has no place to go. There's no safety for her. And I think breastfeeding becomes one of the tiniest issues in her life at the moment. How is she going to survive this relationship and in her own home? And I can't really address that. I do know that telling people, well, you should leave, obviously, that's the answer to your problems. Get the little domestic violence training, and that's very, very difficult for people to do. But I'm thinking more of the person who is in a safe relationship but still can't. Those are the people that I've worked with, if you'd like me to try to address that. But
yeah, so tell me, what are some of the common signs that you see that this mom has an aversion to breastfeeding that you believe is related to past abuse?
Okay, I think I can go through some of those. One is some resentment of the baby. And I know one woman who talked about her baby as a barracuda, and feelings. They almost label the baby, I'm at his beck and call, that kind of thing. So the way the woman talks about this baby may be kind of an indication she's feeling like she's in an abusive relationship. And of course, she wouldn't recognize it in that way, but it sounds that way. Also, detachment from the baby. Just several people have told me that they felt like a babysitter. I'm just going through the motions, which is very, very sad. But other things, exposure of the breasts. So the breasts have to be seen in order to breastfeed. And of course, many of the films that we have show the one with no top on at all. And the woman sees that and thinks, I can't do that. When the nurse would handle a breast, or if the lactation consultant handles her breast to help get the baby on, the woman is feeling a little violated there. And how is she going to give over to that? It's always good to ask permission or to demonstrate on oneself. Hold your breast this way. I had one young woman who pulled the sheet up over her head and her baby, wouldn't let anybody see her. This was in the hospital. She was a teen, bless her heart. And I don't know whether she succeeded in breastfeeding or not. She did not want to be seen.
Yeah, Penny, I would love for you to say that again, because I find that so important, whether it's previous abuse issues or not. I just find that because I worked in the hospital and I was trained to always ask permission. By the time I work with mom in a private practice, they're very used to it. Half of them are just taking their shirt off and bra for me and say, here I am and help me.
Yeah.
But particularly in the hospital situation, how invasive that is to mothers who aren't used to bearing their breasts for people, having other people touch their breasts and just sitting there staring at them, and how it makes most mothers feel when they're not used to being in that position and having a healthcare provider come and just touch their breasts and have the baby and put the two together, and as if it's like they're just shaking their hand.
Yeah. It's very businesslike, isn't it?
Yeah, yes.
I think that asking permission is one thing, but you know what? An awful lot of women in that situation will not have the courage to say no. This nurse who knows everything is saying, may I handle your breast or take your breast in my hand or something? And it takes a lot to say, no, you can't. So I wouldn't even ask permission. I would assume we're not going to do that. And I think the person, I'm not going to say she has to strip down. Although that would equalize the situation, wouldn't it? If two naked women were showing each other how to handle their breasts.
That would definitely neutralize the situation.
That definitely would. But if we'll say nurse or the lactation consultant, but if she could show how to cradle the breast and, to form a nipple, however she wants to do that. And she could even say, this is how you can do that. And she could bring a fake breast with her if she wanted to, or demonstrate on her own clothed body. She could have a doll with her and show how to place the baby. And if they're doing the baby-led breastfeeding, that's a wonderful thing to do. And you don't have to do a lot of handling at all. Then what I would do after showing this is how you can shape your breast and help the baby find its way onto the breast, and say, how would you feel if I left the room for a moment, you give it a try, or would you rather I stay here and I could guide you if you need it? And then the woman might feel free saying, well, you could go and I'll see what I can do. I mean, that would be, to me, an excellent way to preserve her modesty. And then the person comes, I'll be back in 5 or 10 minutes, something like that. And then how did it go? And the one might say, well, he wouldn't get on. And then would you like some help? That kind of thing. I think most women that want to breastfeed want to breastfeed. They're not being talked into it. There are a few, we do our best. But I think that respecting her privacy, respecting her instincts for being able to get her baby on, and knowing about the baby-led breastfeeding, I love it. Because it really is two of them that are doing this now. And they don't need an expert. And most of the time, that's going to work.
I think that's a perfect way to put it. What I love about what you just said is you're giving her a choice. You're giving her a little bit of education. You're showing her over your clothes, and then you're asking her if she would like help, or asking her if you would, that you could come back in a few minutes. And I think that's, again, the same thing about how we're treated during birth, and the control that we feel like we have and how we're treated is the same thing with breastfeeding, that we feel like we have a certain amount of control. She gave me a choice. Sometimes the word control always sounds like a negative thing, but I do think it can be a positive thing, like in this instance, that you are giving her control. You're saying, would you like me to help you? Or would you like to try that? And I'll come back. And just having that choice can go a very, very long, and her opening up to you and saying, sure, stay, or come back, or let me show you, or have you show me.
Yeah. And a few basic principles like a wide open mouth and it shouldn't hurt and that stuff. Those are all things that could be, gotten through at that time. So those are some of the ways, but also the baby, the sensations of breastfeeding, the letdown, and the pleasurable sensations that many women have, especially after the first few feedings when, there might be some awkwardness or soreness. For abuse survivors, sometimes the pleasurable feelings of a baby suckling are confusing and triggering because, I hate to say it, but young children whose breasts were fondled inappropriately or teens, the pleasurable feelings are confusing. So this can bring up memories, body memories, revulsion. I'm not supposed to take pleasure in this, So that can be very, very hard on the person. Another thing that night feedings are often very difficult because, and again, I hope people aren't too triggered by my being so frank, but being awakened at night by the perpetrator. So, it's almost unsafe to fall asleep. And then here's our baby waking to be fed in the night, and the mother expected to respond. And some women have found they can breastfeed during the day, but they hate it at night and they get angry. And Phyllis came up with a wonderful solution for this. And that was, rather than having the baby wake you up, set an alarm and let the alarm wake you up, about 2.5 hours or whatever it's going to be. And it won't be perfect. It won't be baby-led. It won't be breastfeeding on cue. But it's a lot better to get mad at the clock than it is to get mad at the baby. That saved a breastfeeding relationship for one of Phyllis's clients. And we've talked about that with our clients since, because it was such a good solution for that problem.
Yeah, I was going to say, thank you so much for that, because that's not anything I had really thought about, how the nighttime feedings, how when the mother herself is asleep, how being woken up by a baby might really trigger those negative emotions. And I like what you said, be mad at the alarm, not the baby.
Yeah, right. So that's a very simple solution, to what could be an enormous problem. And then, of course, we talk about the difficulties of the sensations, et cetera. And so many women who are committed to breast milk, they want their babies to get breast milk. They know it's best. They're good moms, and yet their bodies are revolting against the baby on the breast. And that's where I think the pump and feed becomes a good solution. And many lactation consultants consider that to be almost a failure of saying, okay, you can't do it. You got to do it this way. This is a solution. It's not a problem. And I know women who have pumped and fed for months, and I think they deserve the Mother's Day Medal of the Year for that, because we know it's harder, but it's the way they can get breast milk to their babies without feeling violated or triggered at the same time. I've also had people that have been able to do that for quite a while, and then as they gain confidence and feel successful, then they're able to let the baby try at the breast. And so maybe at 4 months of age, the baby starts breastfeeding.
Can you explain to me, if you know, what the difference is? And I'm thinking it has more to do about control and the baby not, quote unquote, demanding. I'm not thrilled with that word. I'm glad we're using cue feeding a lot more. But the pump is still at the woman's breast, and she still has milk coming out, and she's still getting feelings of letdown. But I'm wondering if moms do better with the exclusive pumping because they feel more in control about when they pump and how they're using their breasts rather than a baby doing it.
I think that's part of it. The woman is delivering the milk herself. She is able to do it. But I think it's the mechanical part of it too. This is not a human being at my breast, and so the machine, she doesn't have the same feelings about the machine. I mean, some might, but others won't. And they'll find it acceptable. They can tolerate this, so that it becomes less of a personal thing. And the baby is not doing this to me. I am deciding to do this, and this setting it. I'm telling when to stop. I'm in control over this, and I think it's saved a lot of breastfeeding relationships. Truly.
And I really like how you say it's not a problem. It's a solution, and it's a great solution.
Yeah, I see it that way, and people need to be admired and complimented for finding that way and finding a way to meet the baby's needs and not have to sacrifice some very important emotions in themselves.
What else can you think of with regards to breastfeeding aversion that moms have, that once you recognize the signs, what we can do as consultants to help them?
Well, something that's coming right into my mind is the woman who starts off breastfeeding well. She's an abuse survivor, and she breastfeeds well. And then around 2 or 3 months of age, she starts to hate it. And I've had a few women like that. in my practice. And I'm not a lactation consultant. I'm just here to listen and to come up with practical ideas. But this was one woman. I was her birth doula. She had been referred to me for sexual abuse counseling by her midwife because she had expressed a real worry about not being able to breastfeed because she had been abused repeatedly by boys. She was in foster care, in and out. Everyone was abusing her. Her breasts were very large. The boys at high school would squeeze her breasts, as she'd walk by, and it was horrible. And so she told the midwife she was not afraid of birth, but she was afraid of breastfeeding. And I'll be honest, that was a tough one for me. And then I was her doula for the birth, and the baby went to the breast, and she nursed, and I thought, I must be a better counselor than I ever thought. It's all working. But that was so strange because then, I completed my relationship with her. And then when the baby was in that 2.5, 3 months time, she called me up. She said, I'm hating breastfeeding. I want to stop. She was furious. And I said, what's going on? And it turned out that this is the age where the baby starts to enjoy being at the breast and express that. The baby would hold the nipple in her mouth and grin at her mom. And she'd stroke her mother's breast and make sounds while she was breastfeeding, obviously taking great pleasure in it. And until that time, it was pretty much businesslike. I'm getting the baby on, feeding, she's gaining, I'm doing a good job. But now when the baby was showing pleasure in this, that's what triggered her. And she hit her baby. She hit her baby's head when the baby was feeding. And I said, no! My first thought was, stop breastfeeding if you're going to do that, And that was our solution. And I don't know. She needed deep physical psychotherapy, I think. But I can't give you a solution, but I think maybe the value in my telling you that story is that it can come up later. And if the lactation consultant is still involved, which she may very well not be because everything was off a great start, but if someone comes back with that kind of reaction to her baby's pleasure at the breast, then I don't know the solution. But I think that we ought to know that it could happen. And then if I had had more training, I might have said, let's get together and let's talk about this. All she wanted was my suggestion that she not breastfeed. I wish I had thought better about how we could talk about that and try to separate those feelings of resentment of her baby's pleasure from all the feelings that she had when she was being abused.
I think it's a hard position for both sides to be in because she's obviously all of a sudden very majorly escalated to this crisis mode. And we know that being in therapy will take probably quite a while for her to get to the bottom of it. And she's having those really bad feelings towards her baby, who is now, you're right, is now becoming socially interactive and is probably, taking their hands and their fingers, maybe grazing against the other breast and, building that part of the wonderful part about breastfeeding is now building that relationship, and the baby is enjoying and starting to engage and starting to interact. And now that's this huge, it's for some moms, like this mom anyway, it sounds like it was more than just a quote unquote turn off. It really made her angry and brought up really bad negative feelings. So that would be a very, very difficult for both sides to be. And you as, trying to help her work through it, and her as a mother. I mean, I can't, at that age, you're still nursing a baby 8 or 9 times a day. And I almost can't imagine doing it when you're so angry at your baby. Yeah.
Well, the one thing I was able to do was to tell her, look, you gave your baby 3 months of breast milk. And, and that was a pretty big accomplishment for someone with a history like hers. I did want her to feel that it was the right, it was not a terrible thing that she was doing. And we just have to, she has good reason. We have to keep that in our heads and not blame her or say, if you try harder or, some lactation consultants are very persistent. Every woman can breastfeed. And damn it, you're going to too. They don't go there, but I think the woman gets the feeling that, it's try this, try this, try this, try this. And the woman's ready to throw in the towel. And we have to be understanding of that. If we're eternally optimistic and it's not working, somehow acknowledgement of the woman's feelings as this is failing and this is failing.
Yeah, I've been known to tell some moms that I know this is coming from a lactation consultant. However, we need to talk about your breastfeeding. And I'm not giving her permission to stop breastfeeding, but I'm explaining to her that it's okay if she doesn't want to, given whatever her circumstances are going on. Like when I recognize that and see that it's just not a good situation, then I'll be the first one to say you might need to rethink this, because, she's doing this push-pull in her head. And then, of course, she's going to a lactation consultant that she thinks is going to be, if you don't do anything other than breastfeeding, then that's not good enough. And I don't think the world runs that way. And, clearly neither do you. And that there are reasons why a woman who, for purposes that we're thinking, all the anatomy and the supply and baby who can transfer milk, that everything should be working really well. This is one of the way I started this conversation, for no other purposes, intent purposes, that she shouldn't be able to. But then you find out that there are reasons why they might not be able to. Mm-hmm. And then you need to help make everybody okay with that.
Yeah. Good summary.
Yes. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you actually to summarize. So what is one thing that you've learned working with women in birth and breastfeeding? If you had to share some of the wisdom that you've learned along the way, what's just one of the things you'd like for moms to know?
I think one of the things that I'd like them to know is that this time in their lives, the childbearing time in our society, is pretty short, 3 to 5 years maybe. A woman might have 1 or 2 kids, or, we're not having as many children as generations ago. And I'd like to point out that this is a very unique time, more demands and different demands on you than at any other time in your life. And I want you to just understand that this is a few years out of your entire 90-year lifetime or whatever. And try to give over to that. Try not to, regret that you can't, go out on dates whenever you want to, or, that your career is on hold temporarily. But to recognize that this will pass and make the most of it, because it's a very special time. And if you're feeling a lot of remorse or regret about what you're not able to do right now, focus on what you can do and know that this is not going to last very long.
It's so interesting. It's wonderful words of wisdom. And I do hear other people sometimes say that. Sometimes they're in their 30s or 40s. And we're not going to talk about your age per se, but I think that you have lived a good, full life up to this point, and you have children and you have grandchildren, and you've counseled people in birth and breastfeeding and siblings, and you've just seen the whole gamut, and you're walking away saying, this is actually just such a short time period. Don't get so hung up on, I can't wait for date night, or I need to start weaning my baby, because I need to start going back out to date nights or back out with friends, or I need to have my body to myself. And of course, sometimes I think that when we have the conversation, that elicits guilt. It's not meant to elicit guilt. It's just meant to broaden your horizon a little bit and recognize that in the end, it's actually a very short time period of your life.
Yeah, it feels like forever.
When you're in the thick of it, it feels like forever. Well, I know I'm from Arizona. I know you were just here and you gave a presentation. You are so busy, Penny. I'm going to send people to your website. But if you can share with us if there's anything in particular you're working on, a book or a presentation or anything that you'd want us to know about.
Well, there's lots of presentations coming up, but I am going to be doing one with a nurse, a wonderful nurse, Kathy Spring. In November, we're going to be talking about traumatic birth, but we're going to be talking about it from a slightly different angle. It's called secondary traumatic birth, secondary PTSD, but it's not post-traumatic, it's secondary traumatic stress disorder. For people who are witnessing a traumatic birth, like the partner, the doula, the nurse, even the midwife or care provider, but also we're going to then follow up with a discussion of what is called horizontal violence. And this is sometimes after there's a poor outcome and the staff is all getting defensive or blaming someone. This gets to be a very difficult situation in a hospital staff. Very sad reality. In many hospitals, the staff don't get along with each other. And then an episode like this comes up where they should be pulling together and supporting each other. Often they're finger pointing and trying to blame each other. And Kathy Spring, has been a nurse for 30 years, and she's been through a lot of this. And we feel this is a very important topic to try to bring out. It's going to be a webinar that we do through Patch. And I can't even remember the day, to be honest. It's November something. We just had to postpone it. If anyone is interested in that, that's one thing I'm doing. I think I've got other webinars coming up, but I can't remember right now. I'm bad.
Are they listed on your website? I know so quite a few.
I'll ask Katie. My workshops are, I'm going to be in New York City. I'm going to be in Philadelphia in this month.
I really wanted to double, triple, just really, really thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me. It's very enlightening. This is such an important topic and one that is not talked about. And certainly there aren't enough people, knowledgeable experts like you, to chat with about it. And it's not, someone might sit and listen to a show like this where they might not necessarily purchase a book and sit and read it. So it is the time that you spent with me is so invaluable, and the reach will go to many, many thousands of moms. So I want you to know that your time was well spent, and I appreciate it very much, Penny.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Lori.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Was that not a great show? What a wealth of information Penny is. She gave us such a great background in her work history leading up to the work that she's currently doing. I am grateful for the work that she is doing in the field of traumatic births and counseling moms, as well as the energy she puts into speaking and providing workshops and educational seminars to help healthcare providers understand how to best work with abuse survivors. Be sure to check out her website, and if she is speaking anywhere close to you, perhaps you will take a friend and go learn from her. I would like to end today's show by encouraging you to subscribe to the All About Breastfeeding show. This means that it will automatically be downloaded for you, and the beauty of this is that you will never miss a show. If you go to allaboutbreastfeeding.biz/podcast, you will see instructions on how to subscribe to the All About Breastfeeding show. Monday's show will be where I continue to have guests for interviews. Wednesday's show this season begins a 12-week series on infant feeding practices as I take you on a tour of the world of breastfeeding. Tune in Wednesday to learn more. Friday's shows begins a 12-week series where I will bring you the most frequently asked questions I receive about breastfeeding. Until we meet again, I leave you with this quote. If you are looking for a happy ending and can't seem to find one, maybe it's time to start looking for a new beginning instead. Until then, bye-bye.